Hi, my name is Sandy Hart, and I am the president of SARA, the Spiritual and Religious Alliance for Hope. And I want to welcome you tonight into the Red Tent. Our conversation tonight is Understanding Mary Magdalene, Shifting Mythology and Stories, and the role we play in resurrecting her. Tonight's call we're really lucky to have facilitated by Mary Magdalene scholar Dr. Jeanne Michele. Dr. Jeanne is someone whose interest in Mary Magdalene has been rooted since childhood. She's always had an inner knowing and connection with Mary Magdalene. Her fascination with her led to choosing her as the topic for her dissertation and research, which was published in 2007. She's made 2 trips to France to deepen her connection with Mary. Her most recent trip was in July of 2017, and she is currently working on her first book with the working title, A Matter of Faith, the Deconstruction and Resurrection of Mary Magdalene. Jeanne leads Mary Magdalene events locally and is planning to lead a group to France in July of 2018. Tonight's call, the recording didn't get started right away, so you will jump in right as Jeanne's just diving into the history of Mary Magdalene. So with that said, I want you to settle in, relax, and enjoy this really interesting conversation.
Bit of historical information, because I think that's an important thing too, because all of a sudden, you know, we have the Christian story that has been in place for a really long time, and then we have Mary Magdalene whose role has shifted. Hang on one second. So if we look, one of the ways that we know what we know is through biblical texts, okay, and through the interpretation of those texts. So if we use the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita and the Old Testament and the Quran, so there's all kinds of biblical scriptures. So if we use that as a basis for Mary Magdalene, she was the one woman that was mentioned by name, which gives her a kind of reverence, even in the Bible, even in biblical texts, which at that time were written in the voice of the men who were divinely inspired. But as you know, the people who write stories write it also with through their own filters. And male voices and pick up and write different things than female voices would. And not to say all women would write the same or all men would write the same, but coming through a masculine voice, you pick up different things in the energy of a story. So what we know about her is that she was mentioned in the Bible 13 times. She was a woman who anointed Jesus. And in those days, an anointing was only done by a prophet of God. So we start to see, as we play out and we look in the cracks and crevices of even biblical history, that there potentially is something more to the story. So we get hints. And when I've read so many books by feminine theologists, and you really have to sort through the cracks and the crevices to find the little nuances of the story as you're searching to find deeper truths. So we know she anointed him. We also see her in the gospel writings, in 3 of the gospels, as a witness to Jesus's resurrection. And in the Gospel of John, she was the sole witness to Jesus's resurrection, which, when you're looking at it from the perspective of the Christian story, that is really the center and the heart of Christianity, and that's the resurrection of Jesus. And that Mary Magdalene was a witness in all of the Gospels that mention the story is pretty profound. And then after that story, she simply disappears. She just simply disappears. So what really happened to her? We have some questions and some curiosities about that. And as we think about So I'm going to go back. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the history. At that point, now let me go. Hang on. So in the beginning, before the Bible was actually written and came to be a book of scripture writings, it became the canon or the law of Christianity, there were all sorts of other writings that were out there. And there were sides of Christianity that was more mystical in its orientation, which is more about an inner knowing. And there were sides of Christianity that were considered the canon law, which are the ones that ultimately made it into the Bible. And that occurred in 325 in the Council of Nicaea, in which the things that were not authorized Christian writings were tossed away, and we lost about 85% of the writings at those times. So we don't have a complete picture on what happened because so many writings were destroyed. So then in 380, after the Nicene Creed, the Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So it went from being a movement where, just like we're doing today in the Red Tent, people would gather together and talk about spirituality. That would be how spirituality grew. Most of the spirituality in those times too were in the hands of the women. It was women that got together in small circles and held the spirituality for their town, just like we're doing today. But as Christianity moved from those small, and pre-Christian history, first we had a matriarchy, which was all about the divine feminine and feminine worship. And people like Maria Gumbatis, who recovered all these little statues of feminine deities, really helped to uncover the fact that we did have a worshiping society that was about the feminine, the divine feminine. And then with the Abrahamic traditions, with the Old Testament, and with the foothold of Christianity, we move from that matriarchal society into a more structured dogma and into a patriarchy. And at that point in time, it was about, having the canon, having the law. So we moved away from those times of trusting our intuition and trusting our direct knowing and spiritual connection with God. And so many of these writings were destroyed. And at that point in time, also the role of women had lessened in the church and in this new church, in this new budding church. And in 591, Pope Gregory, and this is how the whole story of Mary Magdalene was distorted, wrote and delivered a homily in which Mary was branded as a prostitute. So he used that to talk about forgiveness. And in those days, the greatest sin that a woman would commit was to be branded a prostitute with sexual sins. And so in that moment, he really discredited her, from being this very holy woman to somebody who was a prostitute that Jesus saved. And so I look at that story too, and I think about how we as women today, sometimes are branded with stories about us that are not true, and how we attempt to overcome them. But the funny thing that happened in that story, though, was she also became a role model for people who were marginalized. There were people in the south of France in particular who identified themselves as stepping outside of the traditional role of marriage, who sometimes engaged in prostitution, and she became their hero. And she became the patron saint of women. So it feels like every time that the church might have tried to squash her role, the people were the ones that ended up resurrecting her, and the people were the ones who found so much heart and spirituality in her, and her role kept elevating. So I want to stop for a moment, and I want to ask you guys, because there's so much about her, is the history helpful, or would you also like me to go into some of the mythologies in France, do any of you have a comment on that? Who is that? Yeah, I don't know, Sandy, if you need to unmute them or how that works. I can't hear you, Sandy. Can I unmute you?
No, sorry. Raise
Oh, that's okay.
if you want to say something, a sudden thing. I'm going to systematically unmute you, but go ahead.
Okay.
All right, everyone should be unmuted or get.
Okay, so I would love to know, because there's so much information, there's so much historical information, there's so much information about her story in France. I'd like to know, like, if you all have a thought on where this, if the history is helpful, or if there's some other things that you would like for me to address.
This is Lynn.
Mm-hmm. Lynn.
I would love to hear more about France because I have a grandmother from France.
Okay.
So,
all right, that's awesome.
And I, like you, have been touched by Mary Magdalene early on in life, very early on in life, probably many more years than you actually. But so I am absolutely thrilled that you have a background in this, and I just want to suck all the information out that I can.
Okay. Also, so I think, does anyone else have any thoughts? Because I think I will go into Joan Marie.
Well, I'm curious if you have found any information about like the temples of Isis or the connection with Tantra, that's part of how they really disconnected and devalued the sacredness of our sexuality.
Okay, awesome question. See, you guys have more juicy stuff than I've started out with. Sandy.
And also, you know, there is something that I failed to mention that dawned on me after you had started talking. Is that Kathy and Kay and the Women of Spirit and Faith, and Sarah's also a co-founder of an event coming up called Encountering Mary Magdalene Past and Present, and that's going to be on November 12th, and you're all going to get information on that. But I'd like to ask Kathy or Kay if there's anything that perhaps you know that may not be covered at that conference that would help kind of fill in more blanks, and how we can be really well prepared and informed walking into Chapman in November. If there's anything you would like Jeannie to talk about too, because I don't have anything, and I mean, I'll go with the flow here.
Well, Kayleen Asbo, who led our pilgrimage to France, is going to be the speaker in November. And we're not sure exactly what she's going to be talking about. But she has a very strong interest in the lost books, the wisdom gospels that were edited into the Bible, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene,
right,
the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, and others. And I'm sure she's going to be touching on those at that event, and a strong history in art and music as it relates to Mary Magdalene in France and in other parts of Europe. But I know that from my perspective, Jeanne, I want to hear more of your story, of your journey.
Thank you, Kathy.
To France and your lived experiences there.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So what I'm going to do is then I'm going to talk about France. I think that seems like the place to go next. I know history can be a little dry. There's so much, and it is so interesting to set the background for it. But where she comes alive, I think, with all of us, is how she touches our soul. And I love what you said, shared just a little bit about what Kayleen is going to talk about is the art. I have this amazing PowerPoint presentation with like 50 slides of art, because her story and her voice was carried through the paintbrush of the artist. Her mythology is carried through her stories, and it is such beauty, and those are the things that really touched me. So I love that we're going to see more of the art and so much symbolism and richness in that. So with my trips to France, so what happened was, as I was working on my dissertation, I finished my PhD program in 2004, and I thought, I'm going to reward myself and I need to go to her sites. So I visited France and Italy at the time. And the artwork in Italy on Mary Magdalene is very powerful. It was a total Mary Magdalene trip. So I'm going to tell you the stories of how Mary Magdalene wove in and out of my experience as I was on these trips, and what these little towns held for me. There's such a precious reverence for Mary Magdalene in France. The French people really seem to love her. So here's one of her tales. There's this little gypsy town called Sainte Marie de la Mer. And Kathy, I think you visited that as well. But what is so beautiful is the myth and the legend is that after Jesus's death, Mary Jacobee, Mary Salome, Martha, Lazarus, a saint named Saint Maximin, and Mary Magdalene, and a little girl named Sarah were all set adrift in a boat because they were sending them away from the Holy Land. And they were really just, sending them out to their death. But what happened, of course, is in many mythologies is that they were not destroyed. They let their boat land in this little gypsy town called Sainte Marie de la Mer. And there was a church there dedicated to her. So when they arrived, Mary Magdalene then became an evangelist. She began preaching, and she began talking about the stories. And the texts that Kathy was referring to, or the texts that were left out of the Bible that were discovered in the late 1700s, some of them through the 1900s, and they paint a totally different story. They look at spirituality as more of mysticism, as inner knowing. And Mary Magdalene was painted as, in the Pistis Sophia, which is one of the texts, as the woman who knew the all. Jesus praised her for her knowledge and her information and her ability to grasp complex ideas. And these texts also pointed to Jesus as coming to her after his death. So that's when these other texts were written, after the death of Jesus, when Jesus would appear in visions to Mary Magdalene. So as she's arriving at Sainte Marie de la Mer, she starts talking and she starts preaching, and she is this spiritual leader of the people in France. And in this little gypsy church, right on, just a little bit off the water, in the basement of this church is this little black saint named Saint Sarah, and she's dressed in all these little gypsy tattered pieces of cloth, and the people of this town look to her as their patron saint. And they've got candles lit, and it's just this beautiful little commemoration to her. And you walk down the steps of the basement, and there she is. And so the story that we hear is that she was some kind of a servant girl. But then you look at the other stories in the little towns like Rennes-le-Château, and they believed that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were most probably married. They believed that there was a secret, and when there's this big search for the Holy Grail, that actually Mary Magdalene was the Holy Grail, and it was her body that was the Holy Grail, and that she carried the blood of Jesus. So there is speculation, and part of the mythology is that this little girl named Sarah was actually Jesus' and Mary Magdalene's daughter. Now, the church doesn't say that, but these are all the other mythologies around that. But the church does say that they believe that Mary Magdalene came on the boat with Mary Jacobee and Mary Salome, and one of those, and I'm not sure which one, is supposed to have been the mother of the gospel writer John. I was just told this on my last trip in 2017. And what's interesting about the Gospel of John, for those of you that are familiar with the Christian Gospels, it is written in a much different form than the other Gospels. It is one that is way more open, and it's a little bit more along the lines of a lot of the writings that never made it into the church canon. And so the speculation that his mother arrived with Mary Magdalene, feeds into that story being a little bit different. So, Sainte Marie de la Mer, we've got this little gypsy girl in the basement of this church, and it's thought that Mary Magdalene evangelized there, and she was a very profound spiritual leader. Then there is another church called Saint Maximin, which is a little ways away from Saint Marie de la Mer, which is dedicated to Mary Magdalene. And in that church, they have what they believe to be her skull. And in Catholicism, something that what was very powerful is the idea of relics. And the bones of the saints were thought to carry the power of the saint. So they actually had times in, the anywhere between the 700s to almost the 1900s where churches would try to steal relics from other churches because they thought then that church possessed the power of the saint. So for this church to have Mary Magdalene's skull is very highly venerated. And again, the skull is kept in the basement of the church. You have to go down and visit it in this gold reliquary. And on July 22nd, which is her official feast day in Catholicism, they actually take the skull out of the basement and put it on veneration where people can come and be right next to it. They have this big procession that goes up to her cave, which was the place that Mary was supposed to have meditated for years and years after Jesus's death. And visiting those places was so powerful. There's so many people that I think that we all want to touch the sacred. And whatever that looks like to us, we want to experience that. And I think we are moving into a totally new place in our history where we've gone from matriarchy to patriarchy, and now we're coming into the need for spiritual partnership. And the shifting story of Mary Magdalene and Jesus is actually being spiritual partners really is helping us, I believe, usher in a totally new time that we have never seen before in the history, in human history. And they carry these stories in France. So for me, I was so touched by all of the people that were there to venerate her on her feast day. But the most profound thing for me was when, after the celebration was over, and this was the day after her feast day, and most of the crowds were gone, but her skull was still out in the middle of the church, that I sat there and I meditated on her, and I called her in, and I said, what do we need to know about you? And what I really got is, if you look at every single writing about Mary Magdalene, whether it's in the writings that are outside of the church, like the Pistis Sophia and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Philip, or whether it's even within writings in Catholicism, what we see is a woman who so embodies what it means to love. She loved with her whole heart. She loved with her whole soul. And every single story about her shows that love. And now with this new story of she being connected with Jesus, it feels like we are coming into completion with that. Instead of it being the story of an unrequited love, now we have the two of them coming together as a divine couple. And to go back to what you were talking about, Jeanne Marie, there is so much speculation in other writings and in other stories that she might have been a priestess in the temple of Isis, and she learned the feminine ways, and she was schooled in that. So when she came to meet Jesus, she came with her own knowledge and with her own information and with her own background, and that the two of them together activated one another. She came with her wisdom and he came with his, and it was really a divine coupling where they both brought something to the table. It wasn't just that she sat at his feet in worship, it's that they were more of a partnership. So that is also a part of her mythology and a part of her legend too that exists outside of the church. And let's see what else. Oh, and then another place that I went when I was in France was, there's another cave in the south of France that is very, very primitive. And it is also supposed to be a Mary Magdalene cave. There's something about caves in the sacred feminine. They represent the womb space. They represent our coming together in sacred circle. And in this particular cave, I just felt a very powerful energy. And I'm not someone that goes someplace and say, oh, I feel the energy. But in that cave, it was amazingly powerful. And I really felt her there. And then there was another little body of water I went to where she supposedly baptized people, and I got to immerse myself in that water. So her legends live everywhere, and it feels like this is part of, as we're being tapped by her to see how the pieces of the story resonate with us and what calls us forward. And I think that there is a divine sisterhood that occurs with Mary Magdalene. In Jesus, we had the brother, and now in Mary Magdalene, we have the missing sister, spiritual leader that we so long for and have craved, and moving into that space with her. So those are some additional thoughts on my own connection with her and with her rising again. And in 2016, I don't know if any of you have heard this, or Kathy, if you've heard this, Pope Francis elevated her feast day to that of an apostle. So she finally is becoming more and more recognized for what she does bring to the table. And it's just taken so many, many, many years. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions about that?
Jeanne, I do. It's Lynn.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi. Okay, so what I've recognized, and I intuitively was very in touch with the whole Dan Brown thing before it even became known. And it was driving me crazy, to be honest with you, because I wasn't putting the pieces together until the Da Vinci Code actually came out. But what I've recognized is that if we can embrace the fact that they were a married couple, which I have no problem with being brought up a Christian. I have no problem with that because of the time. That would be normal for a Jewish boy to marry. So that wouldn't even be a question in my thought, nor would it be a question. I know that many people have said to me, in my line of work especially, well, don't you think that despiritualizes Jesus? And it's like, no, not at all. That makes it more practical, much more practical, spiritually, practically, the whole thing. But what I'm seeing today, and have been seeing actually since the 80s, Sandy knows this, is that it's a wedding. It's actually not just a wedding of what we consider to be Jesus and Mary, but if we look at it deeper, we see that it's a wedding of the masculine and feminine. And to embrace that, to absolutely allow that to embrace us, therefore we become whole in our own right as embracing the qualities of masculine and feminine. So I think that is the beauty that this particular record can actually bring forward.
I love that too. And Margaret Starbird, who was one of the first ones that started really becoming popular and writing about her, that she saw Mary Magdalene as the lost bride that never got recognized as being the bride. And it is a coming together mythologically, metaphorically, physically of the masculine and feminine. And we have not had that before in a divine coupling since the dawn of Christianity. So coming to, and as you said too, Lynn, in those days it would have been seen as odd for a Jewish, preacher, rabbi to not be married. And the fact that they were traveling so close together would have been more odd than for him to be married, for sure. And in a lot of in the Gospel of Philip, she is seen as his companion. There's a writing about him loving her and kissing her, and part of it is missing, but we see in there that she is his spiritual partner. She is his partner, and the likelihood that they were married is pretty strong. And it makes the story more complete, instead of us always.
Yeah, Jeanne, it sounds like your voice is distorted.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Keep talking.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was is about this word Mary. That the Marys were the women leaders of the Nazarenes, of the Nazarene branch of Christianity, which was a very feminine-led early branch of Christianity. And that Mary isn't so much as a name as a title, almost like a priestess in the Nazarene tradition. And I think that reinforces the idea that Mary Magdalene came with her own spiritual authority. She came with her own spiritual wisdom. And there was that exchange between that animating. She animated Jesus and Jesus animated her. And the other piece that I just want to chime in with, you mentioned Margaret Starbird. And I just went back to read The Woman in the Alabaster Jar. I hadn't looked at that book for like a dozen years or more. And she says in the beginning of that book that when she first heard this idea that Jesus and Magdalene were married, it upset her. She didn't like that idea. She didn't agree with that idea. And she set out to do the research to disprove that idea and couldn't. And in fact, ended up becoming completely transformed in her own thinking. And part of what transformed her, part of what really convinced her that there was something going on here, was the way that the church had so systematically tried to silence and devalue Magdalene. And that for her was a red flag. She said, in her own words, where there's smoke, there's fire. And she saw all that smoke. She saw all those ways that they kept trying to push her off into the margins. And yet she kept sliding back in somehow as evidence that there really is something going on here.
And yes, and we have seen it happen over and over historically too. She pops up, and I have seen her when I went back and done the research. She pops up in her popularity when something is going on with women or something is going on in the world. She all of a sudden she resurrects again, and then there's always an attempt to squash her, like the story of the prostitute in the early in the late 1200s, in the 13th century. You know, the women of the church, the abbesses, were taking charge. They were actually saying some of the masses. They were training the priests. Magdalene was very popular then, and then there was a pope who came in, and Pope Innocent, he stripped the women of all their power. He took away their right to preach and to deliver communion, and that was at the same time that there was also this sect of people, which Kathy, I think you know about too, the Cathars and the Knights Templar, who were these people that were thought to be protecting a story, and the story they were thought to be protecting was that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and they had a child. And in that time when they were pushing her story down again, there was also struggle. The Catholic came to bleed housing story, and then something came in again to push it back down. And I think that goes along with what you're saying about what Margaret Starbird has shared. So time and time again. And yet this day and age, we are coming into such a strong place of feminine spirituality, the feminine place of God, face of God. We are seeing that so rising again, juxtaposed against a really strong, maybe I want to say patriarchy's last stand, but such a strong,
don't underestimate patriarchy.
Okay, such a strong against
stand. Yeah.
But I mean, we're seeing And her popularity, again, 2017, I felt called again. You need to go to France. You need to write about me. And I hadn't felt called since, 2004. And then in 2016, Pope Francis then elevated her status. And we're seeing, it's like a grassroots, like Kathy, with some of the organizations you've started, where as women, we're feeling called, we're feeling an unrest, we're feeling tapped into something, and we're intrigued by this story, and we're curious, and we start doing research. We go to France, and we read, and we discover, and we come up with intuitively what we feel. We connect, we feel inspired, and all of that is kind of a feminine, more of a feminine, you have to label it masculine or feminine, way of knowing, and that is becoming, rising and becoming so powerful, because our world so needs the heart. We so need that. And I think that it's a grassroots effort. It's like with the official resurrection, Mary Magdalene saw Jesus, he resurrected, and then we have all the stories after that. With Mary Magdalene's resurrection, it is taking all of us to help her resurrect. She can't resurrect on her own. She taps us, and we help by spreading the word, or having meetings like this, or the meeting that you're having on November 12th, I believe. And we are part of this coming together, the divine masculine, divine feminine, and of Mary Magdalene rising, I believe. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but I really think that we are part of it, because if we don't carry this lineage in the story, it will just, it will go underground again, as we are awakening more as women, to our own spirituality. And I know there's guys on the call too, and I'm not wanting to leave you guys out, but I am finding, when I told people that I was going to lead a tour in 2018 to the Mary Magdalene sites, I have many people that said, oh, my husband would like to go, and my boyfriend would like to go. And at first I'm thinking, wow, I see this as a journey for women. And I still see some of it as a journey for women, but I love the fact that men are intrigued, and men want to go, and men want to participate too, because it's both. It's masculine and feminine. And I think that's what's really rising. But I think, Kathy, as you said at the beginning of the call, we talked about the feminine has been so suppressed that sometimes it takes a little more effort to have her be totally, fully in her power, so that she can fully stand. And sometimes we need some feminine only connection to help ourselves rise, and then come into power and partnership with the masculine as well. We need both. We need our feminine time, and we need time where it's masculine.
I have a question about that.
Yeah. Is that Dot?
Yes.
Hi, Dot.
A study I did back in the 90s about Mary Magdalene was portraying her and trying to come out of that image as the prostitute. And it portrayed her as quite a successful businesswoman, actually, and that she had things to offer a young teacher, rabbi, prophet, a Jesus of Nazareth, that a lot of people didn't, and that in fact she could very well have been financial backing.
Yep.
Which is a very strong female image of that time, and one that one can understand why the church would want to somewhat diminish. But I guess part of my question is, if we're talking about bringing the feminine and the masculine together, why is it so important that we talk about marriage? Because marriage then is not marriage what it is today. And in fact, marriage treated women as second and perhaps even third class people. So I'm wondering, I mean, I hear the stories, and I have nothing against it. I have no stand whatsoever. It doesn't matter to me one iota. It doesn't change my faith or anything. But it just almost sounds tabloidish, if I may make up a word, when one also thinks of Mary as a businesswoman, as a financial secure, as someone who really believes in this young man who is preaching a gospel. No one called it gospel of the day, but I'm just wondering if there isn't more strength in that type of image of Mary than it is that, yes, she ended up marrying him and they had a little girl. Because to be honest, God didn't need more procreation in that sense.
You know, Dot, I really love what you're sharing. And that's why there's so many mythologies. Will we ever literally know exactly what happened? No. And I think you're right. We have to be careful that it's not, she meets her prince and they run off and they live happily ever after, except he died, but he came back. You know, I think we need to be careful in marginalizing the story or putting it into the typical context, because one other place where she showed up in power was actually the story of her being a prostitute, because then there were other women who chose to not be married. And those women sometimes would become what was known as a hetera. And hetera was somebody who slept with a powerful man, but she had more freedom. And so the heteras actually got to go into the temples in Alexandria. They had got to follow the men into these all male meetings when they were discussing philosophy and important things where the wives could not go. So there was power.
Uh-oh. Is that me who's frozen, or
That we just
You just froze.
Yeah, Jeanne froze.
she's just
don't just
so come
I
on.
think it's just Jeanne.
stereotype
This happens every blue
this story, and we see her as a woman of power in that time.
moon. Oh darn it. Well, oh,
There you are.
See me? I can't see you guys.
okay.
I'm not sure.
We missed much of what you said over the last about minute and a
I
half.
think we lost.
Oh darn.
Oh, we did. Darn. Okay, let me see. I cannot. I'm trying to get
We can hear you and we can
back on Zoom. And
she
okay,
doesn't
if you can hear me, I can't see me, or I can't see you guys. But so what I'm saying is we have to be careful with that story. There I am. Of not going ahead and making it, that the prince kissed the princess and she awoke and they lived happily ever after, but see her as a powerful woman in her own right, that she came into this with gifts, that she came into this with wisdom, that when we look at the stories like the Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, she is shown as a powerful woman of learning that actually teaches the other apostles. So we don't want to simplify her role, Dot, and I love what you bring forward in that. We need to be careful with the stereotype.
Right.
And they might have been married. We don't know, but we don't want to make it marginalize her and make her just the woman attached to the man. Again.
Right, exactly. And that's what my point is. I mean, her role had very, there's even the stories of the demons that were cast out of her. Very often, the more modern church tries to associate that with mental illness as well. So there's various things here that.
I have
go ahead.
Okay, so taking that story, there is a gospel writer, Yves Jean Leloup, who wrote about the Gospel of Mary, and he feels that it was a chakra clearing, that she anointed him as a prophet of God, and he did a chakra clearing on her. So they're both coming into it, potentially helping clear one another. You know how it is with all of us. Sometimes we each need a little bit of a clearing. Not that there was anything wrong with her, but that he was clearing whatever remnants existed in her chakra. So that's another way of looking potentially at the story. So there's so many rich nuances that we are trying to interpret and figure out. But I think when it comes down to it, she was a wise spiritual leader. Lynn, did you have something?
I do on that.
Uh-oh. Did we freeze?
So something happens around this time where everybody in your neighborhood is online, so perhaps your bandwidth is challenged. So occasionally, if you
do you think it's mine? Am I the one that's
individual, whoever, wherever
okay.
you are, where you live? So okay, you're back.
Okay. So did you call on me, Jeanne?
Yeah, Lynn, you looked like you had something interesting to share.
I have tons to share. So,
Good.
this is a passion. This is a passionate subject of mine, and I love what Dot brought in, because I take that for granted that we all know that. But you're right, we don't all remember that she was. But I love the chakra clearing, because it shows that even though we in our spiritual, or what we might consider our spiritualness, that 7-pointed chakra clearing actually brought in the 7 sins that the Catholics tend to look at. Whereas, you've got the greed and the yada yadas all through those 7. And I think that we
lust and
I think we all deal with that at some level. Some of us are a little bit clearer in areas, whereas some of us just aren't. And I'd also like to address the marriage concept, because if we're considering, I never consider marriage and I was married, but I don't consider the marriage as a human appointment, but as a divine appointment. So if we consider that the qualities are intermingled and blend together, and that we consider that the true marriage, I think that from a metaphysical standpoint, that brings us closer to what that could have meant for the two of them. And again, that's not taking anything away from Mary, because she was a powerful woman. She did bring money into she supported him. She was his support financially. So the came from a lot of money. And I think that that's just incredible to see her in her fullness, and how in her fullness and then in Jesus's fullness, the two of them blended. And also, I'd like to point out that my grandfather was actually a Templar.
Really? Oh, you probably have some stories.
Well, no, he didn't share, but he was. Although I still have his pin. I still have his Freemason pin. So they moved into the Freemasonry after the Templars were supposedly wiped out, but he still considered himself a Templar. So yeah, I'm quite attached to this story. So thank you all.
So I may be the one Jewish voice here. I don't know, but something came up very clear for me. And you said you were tapped on the shoulder decades ago, and perhaps it was the morning of 9/11. I was tapped on the shoulder to gather women to pull Sarah together. But I was tapped on the shoulder, or maybe slapped upside the head the other day when the message came over on Facebook.
Yeah, it's nice. You.
Oh, Matthew. Oh darn! I'm now it's
Sandy, can you start again?
Yeah, okay, can you hear me now? I said that perhaps, anytime we have this sort of awakening aha moment, maybe that is Mary tapping on our shoulder. And I was saying that I was tapped on my shoulder perhaps the morning of 9/11 when I heard just bring the women together and, start Sarah. Or the day before yesterday when I got tapped on the shoulder and I was just saying, or maybe it was more like being slapped upside the head, when a man came on Facebook and said, why is this for women only? And perhaps that was what was the inner struggle with me that we were talking about earlier before the call really got started here, was that that it is about balance, that she represents the divine masculine and the divine feminine. And then Lynn, I don't know what it was you said, but very profoundly it came to me that, I understand that Jesus is represented as the perfect example of the best of humankind, the best of mankind, and then some, the perfect being, a godlike being. However, I think together, if the story had stayed intact, together, and they represent the perfect entity, the perfect being, right? I mean, this is perhaps the message we were supposed to have gotten all those years ago, 2,000 years ago, that it is the divine masculine, the divine feminine, and there was that patriarchy again. that
Mhm.
domination again, saying,
Mhm.
no, it's only this way, but in fact it was. And
Mhm.
perhaps I'm just simplifying it, but that just became very profound for me. Oh, someone
Oh,
sharing.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful, and I think that's really the essence of what it's about. Is that coming together, whether they're married, not married. It's that masculine and feminine balance, and that she is whole in and of herself, and she has, Kathy would say, is her own spiritual authority, and he had his, and it's kind of like, isn't it the Elohim and isn't that the masculine, feminine
The Shekinah.
aspect of God? Yeah, yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yes.
That crossed my mind.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, there you are.
Yes.
I'm gonna spell your name.
Hi.
I can't figure out how to make my face come back on. So
You're on now.
You're on. We can see you.
You're on now.
oh, was I on all the time?
Yes.
Yeah,
No. Oh, were you? I don't know.
most of the time.
Yeah.
Oh.
Most of the time.
So I'm reading this book, Ancient Sisterhood. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
By Savina J. Tubal. You've probably heard of her. She wrote a book a long time ago, Sarah the Priestess. Am I still there? Because everybody.
Yes.
Go ahead. We can hear you just fine.
And so this is called Ancient Sisterhood, and I just wanted to read this one part about these two different types of priestesses. She's done incredible research. If you haven't heard of her, every page she's got wonderful things to share. So she says that there were two different types of priestesses. One of them was called a Naditu. Don't forget, she's talking about the time of Abraham and Sarah. So this is very ancient and before. The Naditu priestesses did not bear children. Okay, but the Sugetu priestesses did bear children. And so going back to the time of Abraham and Sarah, for example, what she's talking about in this book is that Hagar was a priestess that could bear children, and Sarah wasn't, and that of course Abraham was a priest, and they were all members of this school. But coming fast forward to Mary Magdalene, we can see that the names that were given of a prostitute actually as they started to turn away from the mother epic, they were putting down the feminine everywhere. And a part of that putting down was taking the priestesses who would have children to, in sacred marriage ceremony at different times of the year, making these women appear as if they were prostitutes. And actually, they were very holy women. Mm-hmm. And so Mary Magdalene was just another one of these. That's what I was trying to give you, those two names, in case you didn't know that.
Oh. Well, here we are at the top of our hour. It looks like Jeannie's frozen. And one thing I love about Zoom is usually we never.
But I see Kay is live.
Hi, Kay.
Hi, Kay.
Hi, sweetie.
You came live.
Oh, good. So let's see. Jeannie is frozen. Well, while she's coming back, I wanted to just let you know that I will be sending, we're not signing off now by any means, we're going to close our circle, but let me take this time to say that I will be sending you an email with information about the November 12th conference. If you're in Southern California and can make the conference at Chapman, please come. And also, because there's so much to really process here, it came to me that perhaps I can just invite you to a blog and we can continue this conversation through some blogging. And because I personally would love to hear from many of all of you actually. But this is something that personally has opened up something in me that I could write volumes about. So I'll try not to, because I talk a lot as it is. I don't need to blog a lot. And Jeanne also had given us some prompt questions that we thought that we'd have time to break into small group conversations. But I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And we also know that Mary's with us, so the spirit is here. Here she is. And I think as soon as she stops moving, it'll probably help her bandwidth. So I'm seeing some very quiet faces. So, Kay, it's so nice to see your face. Thank you for jumping online.
Yep.
Yeah, so Jeanne, are you there? Well, does anybody else have any?
I'm here now.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you. Your face is still frozen online, but we can hear your voice.
Is there anybody who would like to add something while we're waiting for Jeannie's bandwidth to cooperate with us?
I would. I'm a guy.
Oh,
Hi,
Guy. Some balance in the room. Welcome, Guy.
I'm going to bring some of the divine masculine in. And actually, the question I have is about the feminine, because right now there's been a great deal of misogyny in the news, and yet the Pope has been much more supportive of women in the church. And I just heard today that in Saudi Arabia, they're going to allow women to drive. So I'm wondering, is this perhaps a time where women's rights become more equalized? I still don't understand why we didn't stop the PRA in the 70s, but I'm just wondering if there's a time that's coming, and the fact that there's a new Dan Brown book coming out might be something as well, but that maybe there's something that's happening right now that this is a time for the women to really embrace their power. That's my thought.
Mm-hmm.
I am
Amen.
so glad you asked that question. Who would like to answer? What is your first name? Because we're only getting Jay.
I'm John.
Hi, John. Welcome. Jeanne, did you hear that question?
I did. I'm working to stabilize. So go ahead. You guys can answer. Whoever wants to answer. I'm trying to get reset up so I'm more present.
And then you'll just have to unmute yourself. Okay.
So I'd like to say something. I've been following this switch over from the feminine to the masculine to the blending, and also I see, John, this third of women. They're bringing up the Pope. I don't know how many of you saw this back in 1999, where the Pope dedicated the whole next millennium to Mary. He said that if, and I heard him say this, if the mother doesn't come back and save the world, it will not be saved. And so he was going to dedicate the whole millennium to mother, to Mary. Did anyone here see that? Did you ever hear of that?
Can you say that again? I lost you for a minute.
I heard it in a different way.
Okay.
1999. I think I still have the tape of it, and there was a beautiful song that he played also. The Pope said that he was dedicating this next millennium, the whole millennium, to Mary, and that she was the mother of Jesus, and she birthed Jesus, and that if mother didn't save humanity at this time, humanity would not be saved. That he wanted everyone to pray now to Mary, Holy Mother. I thought that was very interesting. And one more thing I want to bring out is I've been following this Women of the Wall in Jerusalem. Very, very amazing. So that's another place, John, that the masculine is struggling and falling. The women have been trying like crazy to get pray at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, which is the most holy site for Jews in Jerusalem. It's the place of the temple that was destroyed. And people go there to pray forever. Well, up until about 50 years ago, is it, if anybody knows, recently, women and men could pray together there, but the men decided to take over, and they put a wall, a barrier down halfway, and the women have to stay on their side and the men are on their side, but the men's side has access to the deep recesses of underneath, and they get the sacredness and everything. So women rabbis decided that they were going to buck the system and pray at the wall, lead services 20 years ago. And for 20 years, they've been struggling and been put in jail, and it's been a mess. And finally, just this last July 30th, they won the right to lead services at the Wailing Wall. That means they can hold the Torah and wear the robes and practice. But the men are still not giving up. And just a few days ago, the women were searched. Their dresses they lifted their shirts up to see if they were hiding sacred scrolls underneath them. So it's not over, but the struggle is happening everywhere, I think.
I think there's always, I have something to add. I think there's always going to be resistance to that feminine rising, of course, right? That's what we've been experiencing more and more. But we're the first time in history where millennial young women are making more than their counterpart boyfriends and husbands. Women hold more wealth in this country anyway, and also girls and women are graduating college at a higher rate, and it's getting to the point where we're beginning to really worry about our boys leaving. I agree. There's actually a study done in New York schools. The Department of Education asked had asked this one person to do a study to determine how girls are disproportionately treated by their teachers, and she came back with different findings. It's really the boys that are getting left behind. Now, I was in this women's march in Los Angeles amongst 100,000 people, men and women. There was a perfect experience of a balance of men and women, and young and old, and it was also, there was no incidents of violence either the whole day. And I heard over all of the marches, 4 million people all around the world, not one incident in violence. However, a few months later, there was a mayoral race for the Los Angeles mayor. 11% of people voted. So if that doesn't say how we want our power, but do we take it? Do we know that our dollar is our vote? Do we know that we can shut down Walmart if we all just agree not to go shopping for a day until they get rid of their child labor clothes? I mean, where are we really exercising our power? I mean, and I'm talking about the actual practical power that we have with our dollar as our vote, and our vote is our power. So, so thank you for asking that question.
I'd like to also point out, because Sandy, you brought up, and so did you, Aaron, millennialism. And I think if we understood that we are actually looking at the Jewish concept of the 7,000-year periods, we are actually seeing all 7,000 years being played out across our world for those that are less evolved, more evolved, etc. But we can actually look and see that a lot of what we're trying to do as maybe maybe we've just crossed into the 7,000 threshold as Americans, as able to have this type of a conversation, as coming together, and as recognizing the divine feminine and masculine. And we want to raise everybody up at the same time in the same rate. And that's just not going to happen according to how people spiritually evolve. So I think we have to have a lot of patience when we see what's happening across the globe, because we are looking at the entire Bible. Actually, we're looking at the entire Bible, which represents pretty close to 7,000 years. It actually represents 6,000 years. And we're the living proof of the seventh from where we stand. So I think that if we recognize that and take that into consideration, we won't be so anxious. I know I've always been anxious. Why can't we get this done yesterday? I was an activist back in the 60s, so it's like, but I've had to learn that there is a process that we all go through, and it's a pattern. It's the pattern on the mount, basically, for those of you who are Christian and understand that lingo, but it's still a pattern that we go through, and it's a spiritual process. And we're learning at different rates. So I think that's to recognize the 7,000 years will help us to understand and have more compassion for those who just aren't there yet. And pray better and harder about that.
Mm-hmm. And I think,
Sandy, Jean Marie has had her hand up a couple of times and she's muted, so she can't speak for herself. So I just want you to know that
you can unmute,
Jean Marie.
Thank you. I just wanted to address a couple things. When Dot talked about marriage, I think that when we look at these books and study this, that I think it's always helpful to also look in terms of metaphor, and that marriage, I think, is very important to look at our inner marriage. And Margaret Starbird talks about that too, that this is the inner marriage of our inner masculine, our inner feminine. And if we address that, it's really, I feel, about the maturing of and the evolution of our spirits, that it's time that we grow up and really look at more of the spiritual purpose of why we're here as human beings, and what that means to each of us and to the world, and the whole picture. So another piece that I wanted to add about Emmy's comment about 1999. I was like one of the most excited people on the planet, because I kept thinking, we always used Roman numerals, and what was the Roman numeral for the new millennium? It was MM. So I'm thinking, oh, she's finally gonna get it. And then some tech guy decides it's Y2K, and I just couldn't believe it. I was pulling my hair out, going, no. So I do
wonderful.
Think there's always that suppression, that we've been through an evolution of the matriarch. I personally think that it has a lot to do with the evolution of the right and left brain. Mm-hmm. And now it's time we use our whole brain and come into the whole brain. So
that's
beautiful.
My
2 cents worth.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Well, and to me too, and growing up Catholic, about that 1999, that the Pope, I agree with you, Emmy wrote some really beautiful things, and he called Mary, the word is Theotokos, and Theotokos means mother of God, and I don't think it's that far to go from mother of God to mother God. How can you be the mother of God and not be part of God? I think it was a real step forward in the idea of the feminine face of God and the divine feminine. So I agree with you. Those are such beautiful writings. And I think the thing about, for me, growing up Catholic is we always had Mary, and Mary has appeared in apparitions, and Mary to me always represented the feminine face of God. And for my mom too, it's kind of like, I don't know if anyone remembers Helen Redding when she called God she. It's almost like that's that undercurrent of we kind of know, but you can't really say it because you're not supposed to. But to me, she was always the feminine face. So just throwing that out there too, and to hear that expressed by the Pope was awesome. And to hear Pope Francis frustrates me, and I hear, Lynn, what you're saying about be patient, but 2016, finally, apostle to the apostle, she's been called, but now officially called that, and yet in Catholicism, women cannot be priests. And the whole reason is this thing called apostolic succession. And what that is that saying that unless you were directly at the Last Supper, you were part of Jesus's lineage and that wasn't handed down to you, you can't be a priest because it all is part of that. She was there. There were women there. It's like a bogus thing. And now she's apostle to the apostles, but women can't be priests. It can be very frustrating. And I agree, we're making progress. But
Jeanne, have you read? You probably have in the Bible this section called Lady Wisdom.
I don't recall. So go ahead.
So Lady Wisdom, and I've got the quote here because I put it in my new book, but it's quite long, so I won't read it all. But she says, "I was there at the foundation. I was there before God created the heavens, before the water was split, before the earth came. I was there." And she goes on to say, she informed God what was going to happen, how to create. They
beautiful.
Didn't the Bible. I don't know why it's there, but you know, when we're starting, like Sandy, I think it was you, or maybe it was Eugene who said, yeah, it was Eugene. We have to piece together these little parts. So I encourage you to look up this poem.
I will.
Lady Wisdom, and it's another thing to put together. You know, because Goddess Epic was there.
What book is that in?
It's in the Old Testament.
Is it Proverbs?
Let's see if
What's the citation?
Proverbs. It is Proverbs, and I'll tell you what it is.
Okay.
Proverbs 8-20. Yeah. And of course, if you go to there, you're going to see many different translations of it, right? In each one of the old ones. So find the one that is the most feminine that you can find.
Yeah, and wisdom is seen as feminine. A lot of times when it's wisdom in other places, it's
feminine.
Considered feminine.
In the Kabbalah, you know.
Always the feminine voice.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I am so excited just hearing what everyone is doing. This is a powerful group, what everyone is involved in and sharing and studying and you know, inspired by.
And putting our own pieces together.
Yes, and seeing how they all kind of intersect and picking up a little piece here and there from, you know, everybody that's kind of stepping into a more fuller, expanded version of who they are.
I really enjoyed learning from you about Mary Magdalene and all the little pieces that you shared with us. And
thank you.
I'd like to have another opportunity for you to go into the history.
Thank you. There's so much. Thank you.
I know what you're talking about. I know I'd love
you do with what you've done too with the Old Testament. Yeah, for sure. And the women of the Old Testament. So awesome.
Well, Jeanne, when you were recalibrating and joining us again, I had suggested that perhaps because there's really so much to absorb and process with this information, not just from, well, the platform that you've provided for us here, the container to really explore this in ourselves and then everyone else's contribution, that perhaps we can continue this conversation on a blog, which would give me the opportunity to share your prompt questions.
Oh,
so
I like that.
Everyone to a blog. We can do it on Medium or on our Sarah site. It doesn't matter as long as we get a chance.
Well, I also have a Facebook group that I've called Path of the Modern Mystic, because I really think I think we are coming into a place where mysticism, we are able to tap into that. You know, it's not about this saint and this holy person being a mystic. It's how each one of us comes up with that. So that's another place. If you all want to go on there and have a forum and talk about that too, that I would love that. So that's another opportunity.
I think you sent me that link, and I will send you Proverbs 8.
Okay. Nice.
Catherine's Creed. May I say Catherine's Creed? I will send you, I don't know, whatever. I've got a whole list of notes here. Some of the books that were mentioned on this call to everybody. And anything else, and how you can get in touch with Jeanne too, perhaps, if you want to bring her to your town for speaking engagements, maybe.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and then some other things. And I just wanted to Before we wrap up, it kind of dawned on me perhaps it might be appropriate, and I asked Joan privately if we can close with her poem that you mentioned.
Oh, her poem's so beautiful. Yes.
So before we do that, I just want to take a moment and thank you all so much for being here on this call and contributing your wisdom and your grace and your curiosity and your courage and everything else that brought your vulnerability. And everything you are. And what I heard from you, the one takeaway I heard from you today was that to pay attention to that feminine rising, to Mary tapping us on our shoulder, pay attention to that and where that lands on us. And is this a moment? Am I being called to step into my power right now, or recognize my feminine power if I'm a man, or and as well as if maybe this is my divine masculine speaking. I'm feeling very grounded right now. Really to pay attention to what lens we're seeing challenges and blessings through, and perhaps Mary is woven into everything.
I love that. Beautifully said.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you again. Blessings and thank you. So
thank you, all of you, for your contribution, like Sandy said, and for your curiosity, and just for being present in the dialogue, because that's where it's about. That's where she lives. It's in the dialogue and in the paying attention. So, and I absolutely love Joan's poem. So that's an awesome way to close. It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you. Should I go now?
Yeah, would you?
Okay. So very blessed am I to live and love in such a beautiful temple, the female body. For I am a Magdalene. I have been hated and scorned, revered and adorned, seen both as saint and sinner. I am a dancer, a healer, a lover, a priestess, a crone, a sister, a mother, a friend. I am a woman. I serve both God and Goddess simply because I know they are one and the same, and so much more. I love and I bless it all. This knowing has united me into the purest union of opposites. It has transformed me into a sacred vessel, filled with this feeling nature of God. My life has become that of a creative expression of a true warrior, a warrior of the spirit, a warrior for the heart. I now stand and look into the face of my fears, and I shall not falter, for my beloved is within me. It is the very breath that I breathe, filling me and guiding me with courage, faith, fortitude, and gratitude, with just a little bit of attitude.
So pretty.
That is beautiful. So beautiful.
And now our circle is closed. Thank you, everybody. And we've been recording this call, so I will be doing all the recording as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great
All right.
evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Blessings to you all.
Bye.
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 Bye.